The bullet didn't make a sound until it was already too late. One moment, Staff Sergeant Marcus Chun was scanning the ridge through his scope, breathing slow, doing what he had done 100 times in 100 places. The next moment, he was on his back, and the Barrett M82 was sliding across the rooftop tiles toward the edge. Somewhere below, in the shadow of a broken wall, the ghost exhaled. He didn't run. He didn't move. He simply chambered the next round and waited, because that was what he did. He picked apart SEAL teams one shooter at a time, and he had never once been wrong about who would step up next. He was already wrong this time. He just didn't know it yet. If this story moves you, subscribe to this channel and follow along until the very end. Drop a comment and tell me what city you're watching from. I want to see how far this story travels. Nobody on the team called her by her first name. That was the first thing you had to understand about Corporal Kira Vaughn, because it told you everything about how she fit into the machinery of SEAL Team 6's forward element at Camp Resolute, a dust-choked forward operating base in Kandahar province that smelled permanently of diesel fuel, burned plastic, and the kind of exhaustion that settles into a person's bones after too many months in a place that doesn't want you there. They called her Doc, same as they called every medic Doc, and when they needed her specifically, they sometimes called her Vaughn Flat and clipped the way operators spoke to people they considered support personnel. She was 22 years old. She was 5 feet 6 inches of quiet, competent efficiency, and she had been assigned to the team 8 months ago as the unit's primary combat medic and unofficially as the person who hauled Marcus Chun's gear when he needed both hands free for the rifle. Nobody thought anything of it. She hauled the gear. She loaded the magazines. She checked the medical kits, rotated the antibiotics, kept the morphine auto-injectors inventoried and accessible, and she never once complained. The senior operators on the team, men who had been breathing the sharp air of special operations since before Kira was legally old enough to vote, regarded her with the particular brand of indifference that experienced combat veterans reserve for people they consider low on the threat assessment of any given situation. Lieutenant Aaron Dawson was the team leader. He was 36, built like a man who had been arguing with gravity his entire adult life and was gradually losing, and he ran his element with the kind of controlled aggression that came from 8 deployments in a temperament that had never learned the word patience. He liked Chun. He trusted Chun. He had staked his team's survival on Chun's right eye more times than he could count, and the arrangement had never failed him. Marcus Chun was the best long-range shooter on the team. Everybody knew it. Chun knew it best of all, and he wore that knowledge the way some men wear medals. Not loudly but visibly all the time, a permanent feature of how he carried himself. He was 31, Korean-American from a small city in Oregon, and he had a voice like gravel in a metal bucket. He had qualified expert on every weapons platform the Navy had offered him, and several they had not officially offered, but that he had talked his way into anyway. He spoke to Kira the way most of them did, not unkindly, just without any particular awareness that she might have an interior life worth accounting for. Vaughn, he'd say, dropping the M82 case at her feet before a patrol brief, clean the bolt group before we step off, and don't over-tighten the gas block you stripped it last time. She hadn't stripped it. She never said so. The morning of the 15th of November started like every other morning at Camp Resolute, which meant it started badly. The intelligence brief Dawson ran at 0500 painted a picture that nobody in the room found encouraging. 3 nights earlier, a coalition patrol 2 kilometers north had been hit by a coordinated ambush that used overlapping fire from 3 separate positions, a tactic that bore the signature of an enemy element the intelligence community had been tracking for 19 months under the designation they had given him informally and then over time, officially. They called him the Ghost. Dawson didn't like using the name. He thought it gave the man mythology he hadn't earned. But even Dawson had to admit, standing in front of the map board at 0500 with a cup of coffee going cold in his hand, that the pattern of engagements associated with this particular shooter was unlike anything the team had faced before. He moves, Dawson said, tapping the map. Every time. Never fires from the same position twice. Never engages unless he has a clean withdrawal route. And he targets the highest value shooter first every single engagement. Petty Officer Second Class Danny Reyes, the team's youngest operator, and the one most likely to say out loud what everyone else was thinking, leaned back in his chair. So he knows what he's looking at. He does his homework. He does his homework, Dawson confirmed. Kira sat in the back of the briefing room with her medical kit open across her knees, checking inventory the way she always did during briefings, hands moving automatically while the rest of her attention was on the map. Nobody had asked her to come to the briefing. Nobody had asked her not to. She was the medic. She went where the team went. She looked at the map. She looked at the engagement pattern. She looked at the 3 positions the Ghost had used in the 3 previous ambushes. And she thought something that she kept entirely to herself because she had learned a long time ago that the best way to be taken seriously was to be quiet until the moment when silence would cost too much. She thought those 3 positions form a line of sight convergence on a single elevation corridor. If he has a 4th position, it's going to be the ridgeline at grid reference Sierra 74. She closed her medical kit. She said nothing. The mission briefing called for a route clearance patrol to the village of Durrani Kala, 4 kilometers northeast of the base, following reports of a weapons cache being moved through the area. The team would move in 2 vehicles, conduct a soft knock at the village elder's compound, gather whatever intelligence was available, and return before midday. Standard work. The kind of operation that had happened so many times it had its own groove worn into the collective muscle memory of the team. Chun spent 20 minutes before departure checking the M82 cycling the bolt, checking the optic running a bore light through the barrel. Kira watched without watching, the way she always watched, from the corner of her attention, absorbing everything without appearing to focus on any of it. "You're stacking your rounds," she said quietly, not looking up from her own kit. Chun turned and looked at her. "What? Your magazine. The top 3 rounds are seated slightly high on the left side. It'll cause feed issues if you're in a hurry." A long pause. The kind of pause that has weight in it. "I've loaded this magazine 1,000 times, Vaughn." "I know," she said. "You're also doing it after 3 days of low sleep and the stress elevation that comes with a threat brief like the one we just sat through. Fine motor degradation is normal under those conditions. I'm just saying I noticed." Chun stared at her for a moment, then looked down at the magazine. He pressed the top round with his thumb. It shifted laterally under pressure just a little. Not much. Enough. He reseated it. He said nothing to her. He walked away. Reyes had watched the exchange from 10 feet away. He caught Kira's eye. He gave her an expression that was somewhere between impressed and confused, the way you look at something you didn't expect to understand and still don't entirely. She picked up her bag. She followed the team to the vehicles. They rolled out of Camp Resolute at 0715 2 MRAP, moving through the pale early light with the careful, deliberate pace of vehicles whose drivers knew that speed was a different kind of danger than slowness out here. Kira rode in the second vehicle, wedged between Reyes and Petty Officer First Class Walter Brock, who was 44 years old and had a recurring theory that the best indicator of when something was about to go wrong was when everything felt too quiet for too long. At 0840, everything went too quiet for too long. The convoy had stopped 300 meters short of the village to conduct a route assessment. Chun was out of the vehicle using the M82's optic to scan the high ground. Dawson was on the radio. Reyes had stepped out to take a position of cover behind the rear vehicle. And then the world came apart. The first shot didn't come from the ridge. It came from a droughted riverbed to the east, less than 200 meters out, and it hit the engine block of the lead MRAP with enough force to set off a secondary explosion from a ruptured fuel line. Before the echo of that shot had finished rolling across the terrain, there were a dozen more overlapping, coordinated, coming from 3 directions at once, and Kira felt the second MARM AP shudder as rounds struck its armor plating. "Contact east, contact north, contact west." Reyes was screaming into his radio as he moved. "We are engaged on 3 sides. Say again, three sides. We need QRF now." Dawson's voice cut through the noise with the clarity of a man who had practiced remaining coherent when the world was actively trying to kill him. "Chun, get to high ground. Get eyes on those positions. Everybody else pull to the compound wall." Kira was already moving. Her training did not tell her to take cover. Her training told her to find the wounded and keep them breathing, and in a firefight that meant moving toward the sound of the shooting rather than away from it, which she had been told was irrational by people who had never had to do it. She got to the lead vehicle in time to see the driver, Petty Officer Torres, slumped over the wheel with blood on his left shoulder, conscious but stunned. She got her hands on him. She pulled him out of the vehicle and dragged him behind the wheel well, which was not the best cover available, but was the best cover that was also adjacent to the casualty. "Torres, Torres, look at me. He looked at her. His pupils were equal and reactive. The wound was a through and through on the outer deltoid, messy but not life-threatening if she controlled the bleeding in the next 2 minutes. I've got you, she said. Don't you move. She got her hands into the wound kit with the mechanical efficiency of someone who had done this in training more times than she had slept in the past year. Pressure, packing, the words that a trauma instructor had drilled into her until they lived in her hands rather than her head. Above her, on the roof of a low mud brick structure that served as an abandoned storage building at the edge of the village approach, Marcus Chun had gotten himself into a firing position and was working through targets. She could hear the Barrett. There was nothing else that sounded like the Barrett, a sound that was less like a gunshot and more like reality tearing at the seam, and she could hear Chun's voice in fragments between shots calling targets to Dawson. Then the Barrett went silent. Not the way a rifle goes silent between shots. The way a rifle goes silent when the person holding it is no longer able to hold it. She heard Reyes scream Chun's name. She heard the body hit the roof. She heard the Barrett slide. Torres grabbed her wrist. Doc. His voice was very steady for a man who had just been shot. Doc, you need to go. I'm not finished. You need to go. I can hold this. He pressed his own hand over the packing she'd placed. Go. She looked at him for 1 second. Then she went. She cleared the doorway of the storage building at a dead sprint and took the interior of the stairs 3 at a time. Her boots hit the rooftop and she went to her knees automatically because she knew that silhouetting yourself on a rooftop in an active firefight was the fastest way to become the next person needing a medic. Chun was on his back 6 feet from the Barrett's position. She got to him in a crawl keeping below the roofline, and she checked him the way she checked every casualty airway, breathing circulation, her hands moving before her mind had fully processed the sight of him lying there, with his helmet cracked and blood running from a bayonet above his left ear. He was breathing. Pulse was fast but strong. The round had grazed the side of his helmet with enough force to knock him unconscious, but had not penetrated. He was alive. He would probably stay alive if nobody shot him again in the next 30 minutes. She looked at the Barrett. She looked at it for exactly 3 seconds. Below her, she could hear Dawson's voice on the radio. QRF is 30 minutes out. I say again, 30 minutes. We cannot hold this position for 30 minutes without overwatch. Somebody give me something. Reyes's voice. Chun is down, Lieutenant. Chun is down. A silence on the radio that lasted less than 2 seconds but felt much longer. Then Dawson. Is there anybody up there? Kira reached out and took hold of the Barrett M82 by its grip. 28 pounds. She knew the weight exactly because she had been the one carrying it across 3 provinces for 8 months. She had been the one cleaning it, loading it, transporting it, cataloging its ammunition. Noting the scope 0 from the last range session in her personal logbook because Chun sometimes forgot, and she had thought it might matter one day. She hadn't known it would matter like this. She got the rifle into position. She got herself behind it. The optic was a Night Force scope 12 power already zeroed to Chun's standard, which she would need to account for because at the ranges she was looking at the difference between his shooting geometry and hers could matter. She adjusted the rear bag with her left hand, squared her cheek on the stock, and took 1 breath. This is Vaughn, she said into her radio headset, her voice steady in a way that surprised even her. I'm in the overwatch position. Tell me where you need me. 4 seconds of silence. Then Dawson, Vaughn, get off that roof. Lieutenant, I have eyes on a flanking element moving up the eastern draw. 4 personnel moving fast. They're going to cut off your extraction route in approximately 90 seconds. I need to know if you want me to engage or if you want to find another solution in the next 90 seconds. Another silence, shorter this time. Vaughn, what is your effective range with that weapon? She put the crosshairs on the lead figure in the eastern draw. He was moving at a half crouch, fast, experienced the way someone moves who knows how to advance under fire. The rangefinder integrated into the optic read 430 meters. 430 meters, she said. Clean line of sight, wind from the northwest at approximately 8 miles per hour. I can take this shot, Lieutenant. The longest pause of her life. Then, take the shot. She took the shot. The Barrett's recoil was a physical event that she felt from her shoulder blade to the base of her skull. The lead figure in the eastern draw stopped moving. The 3 figures behind him stopped, 2, the freeze reaction of people who have suddenly realized that what they thought was a dead Overwatch position is not dead at all. Target down, Kira said. 3 remaining, they've gone to ground. I'm shifting to the northern position. On what northern position? Dawson's voice had a new quality in it. Not quite disbelief. Something adjacent to it. There's a machine gun position behind the low wall at 200 meters due north. Gunner has been firing in 3-second bursts from the same point for the last 4 minutes. He hasn't moved because he thinks your cover is solid and he's trying to suppress movement, not score hits. He's been firing at the shadow under the south vehicle, not the vehicle itself. He hasn't figured out that Reyes moved. She paused. Reyes moved right. Tell me Reyes moved. A half-second gap. Then Reyes's voice slightly out of breath. I moved. Good, because I'm about to remove his suppression option. She shifted the barrel. 200 meters. Wind compensation minimal at this range. She picked the spot above the low wall where a man who believed he was in a covered position would position his head if he was trying to track movement to his south, and she waited. 3 seconds. 6. 9. He came up on the 12-second mark. She fired. Suppressor position is clear, she said. Lieutenant, your extraction route is open to the south. I would move now. On the roof of the storage building with Chun unconscious behind her and the Barrett growing hot in her hands and the sound of the QRF's rotors just barely audible in the far distance, Kira Vaughn felt something that she had not felt in 8 months of hauling gear and loading magazines and staying out of the way. She felt completely exactly where she was supposed to be. It was not glory. It was not the satisfaction of being seen or recognized or finally acknowledged. It was simpler than that and more complicated than that, and it lived in a part of her that predated all of those other things a part of her father had built with cold mornings and long ranges and a patience she had not understood as a child, but understood now completely. She shifted position. Another target was moving. She kept working. The next 18 minutes were a conversation between Kira and the battlefield, and it was a conversation she was very good at having. She moved every 4 shots, abandoning each position before the enemy's counter-sniping instinct could triangulate her location. She used the uneven roofline as concealment, trading fields of fire for angles of protection. She counted her remaining rounds without looking down because she had loaded the magazines herself, and she knew exactly how many she had started with, and her mind was keeping the subtraction automatically the way her father had taught her to do on the ranges outside of Billings when she was 14 years old, and the rifle had been almost as tall as she was. 3 months after her 16th birthday, she had become the youngest national long-range shooting champion in the history of the competition. She had won it again at 17 and again at 18. Nobody on SEAL Team 6 knew this. Her service jacket listed her qualifications as combat medic and basic rifle competency, and the record of her shooting achievements was not there because she had asked quietly and specifically for it not to be. She had had her reasons. She was beginning to think that some of her reasons had been wrong, but she was not going to think about that right now. Right now, she had a firing solution on an insurgent element that was attempting to regroup behind a cluster of abandoned agricultural equipment 80 meters east of Reyes's position, and she needed to make a decision about angles. She made it. She fired twice. The regrouping stopped. Vaughn, Reyes's voice came through the radio. It had changed. The surprise in it was unmistakable, even through the compression of the comm signal. Vaughn, how are you, Simon? Later, she said, I need you to tell Brock to move his position 6 feet to the left. There's a line of sight on him from the ridge that he doesn't know about. A pause. He's already there. I know. Moving at 6 feet left. She heard Reyes relaying the instruction. She heard Brock's voice skeptical and annoyed the way Brock was about most things that hadn't been his idea first. Then she heard the sharp crack of a round striking the ground at the exact spot where Brock had been standing. Silence on the radio, then Brock's voice very quiet. Move him 6 feet left, he says. She was already scanning. She was already looking for where that shot had come from, because that shot had come from somewhere very specific. The angle of impact, the distance, the timing, they told her something. They told her that the person who had taken that shot had been watching Brock for at least 3 minutes, had been watching patiently, waiting for a clean window, had not rushed. A shooter who did not rush. She moved her scope slowly across the ridgeline above the northern approach, letting her vision unfocus slightly, looking for the negative space rather than the object, the absence of the expected pattern, rather than the presence of something wrong. Her father had taught her that too. You don't look for the sniper, he had said, sitting beside her on a hillside in Montana when she was 10 years old, and the target was 900 meters downrange. You look for the place where the world is slightly less random than it should be. The ridgeline was 1,100 meters to the north. At that range, the Barrett would deliver approximately 2,000 foot-pounds of energy at the target. The wind had shifted in the last few minutes, coming more from the west now, and the atmospheric pressure at this elevation would require a specific compensation in her firing solution that she was calculating without a ballistics computer pulling the variables from a memory that had been trained across thousands of hours of competitive shooting. She found the place where the world was slightly less random than it should be. It was just a shape, just a discontinuity in the way the rock met the scrub brush at the edge of a natural hide position. Most people looking at that ridgeline would have seen nothing. Kira looked at it for 6 seconds and saw a man who had been lying in that position for at least 2 hours based on the way the brush around the spot was compressed, and who had not moved since taking that last shot, and who believed with the confidence of someone who had never once been identified from a hide he had prepared himself that he was invisible. She thought Sierra 7-4, just like she'd calculated from the map that morning. She thought, there you are. She did not take the shot. Not yet. Because she was also looking at something else. Something that was wrong about the position. The angle of the last round's impact on the ground near Brock told her the shot had come from slightly left of where the discontinuity in the brush was located. The position she was looking at was real, but it was also, and she was almost certain of this, almost empty. She kept scanning. She kept her breathing slow. She thought of her father's voice. Take your time, Kira. The wrong shot is worse than no shot. Reyes came on the radio again. Dr. Vaughn, the QRF is 12 minutes out. Can you hold? I can hold, she said, but I need everyone to stop moving for 60 seconds. Nobody changes position. Nobody looks up. I need the battlefield to be still. That's a significant ask right now. I know what I'm asking. 60 seconds. A pause, Dawson's voice. All elements, freeze in place. 60-second hold. Do not move. The battlefield went in a relative sense still. The shooting from the insurgent elements had already decreased substantially in the last several minutes. She had removed enough of their forward elements that the pressure had eased. What remained was organized, patient, and professional, which was exactly what made it dangerous. She used the 60 seconds to scan every part of the ridgeline at a pace that felt agonizingly slow and was exactly right. She found him on the 53rd second, not at Sierra 7-4, 30 meters to the right of where she'd expected. A different hide prepared differently positioned to use the main hide as a decoy, and she felt a cold, clear recognition that she was not dealing with an opportunist or even a competent combat sniper. She was dealing with someone who thought the way she thought. Someone who understood the geometry of long-range killing with a thoroughness that was genuinely uncommon. The ghost. He was real. He was here. And he was at this moment 1,060 meters away from her, looking through his own scope, and she had approximately 3 seconds before he finished whatever calculation he was performing, and that next shot came. She had 3 seconds. She did not have a clean shot. The angle was wrong, the wind had shifted, and at this range with this level of environmental uncertainty, a shot taken in 3 seconds without a proper firing solution had a probability of success that she would not have accepted in competition. This was not competition. She fired. The round did not hit him. She knew it before the trigger broke because she knew the shot was imperfect, and a shot she knew was imperfect was a shot she was throwing rather than delivering. But it did something a perfect shot might not have done. It hit close enough that the ghost abandoned his position. She saw the disruption in the brush. She saw him move. He was fast. Faster than she'd expected. He was gone before she could cycle the bolt and reacquire. But he was gone. He had moved. And a sniper who has been found and forced to move has lost something fundamental, the initiative, the patience, the certainty of the prepared position. She had not killed him. She had changed the terms of the engagement. Dawson's voice came through the radio. Vaughn, talk to me. The primary threat on the ridgeline has displaced, she said. He's moving. He will find another position. He is very good, and it will not take him long. But your QRF window should be clean for approach. I recommend you get your men moving south in the next 2 minutes. And Chun, she looked behind her. Chun's eyes were open. Not focused, not tracking. He was conscious in the way that a person is conscious immediately after a concussion, which meant he was present but not useful yet. But his airway was clear and his breathing was even, and his pulse when she reached back and touched his wrist without looking was steady. Chun is alive, she said. He's going to be angry about missing all of this. Get your men moving, Lieutenant. She heard Dawson give the order. She heard the team begin to move. She stayed at the Barrett. She stayed because the ghost was still out there, and a man like that did not simply go away because the math had shifted. He adapted. He reassessed. He found a new position, and he returned to the geometry of the problem with the same patience he had brought to it the first time. That was what made him dangerous. That was what had made him a ghost, not speed or strength or equipment, but the willingness to take exactly as long as he needed to take. She understood that willingness completely. She had been raised by it. The QRF rotors were close now, the sound of them filling the sky, and Kira Vaughn lay behind the Barrett M82 on a rooftop in Kandahar province, and kept her eye on the ridgeline and her finger near, but not on the trigger patient as a season-changing twatting. The team had survived. The ghost had not been stopped, and Kira had just introduced herself to 1,000 meters of open ground in a language that could not be mistaken or misunderstood, and somewhere out there in the rocks, in the brush, in the thin cold air of the Afghan morning, something that had been hunting without being hunted had just felt perhaps for the first time the particular chill of being seen. The QRF helicopters came in hard and fast the way they always did when the radio traffic had been bad enough to cut through the standard processing delay and get someone moving without the usual bureaucratic friction. Kira heard them before she saw them. 2 Blackhawks dropping out of the pale morning sky with the controlled urgency of pilots who knew exactly what they were flying into and had decided to fly into it anyway. She kept her eye on the ridgeline until the last possible second, until the rotors were loud enough to make the air vibrate in her chest. And only then did she pull back from the Barrett and go to Chun. He was trying to sit up. Stay down, she said. I'm fine. You have a grade 2 concussion at minimum, and you've been unconscious for approximately 19 minutes. You are not fine. Stay down. He looked at her. His eyes were tracking better now, the pupils equalizing the confusion behind them receding into something more like awareness. He looked at her face. He looked at the Barrett beside her. He looked at the brass casings scattered across the rooftop around them, and he counted them the way a shooter counts automatically and accurately, and his expression went through several changes in rapid succession. Vaughn, he said slowly, how many rounds did you fire? Enough, she said. Don't try to stand until I clear you. That's not how many rounds did you fire from my rifle. 14, she said. Hold still. He held still, but he kept looking at the brass. 14 casings from the Barrett M82, a weapon that most operators needed extensive range time to shoot effectively at distance, scattered around a combat medic who was currently checking his pupil response with a pen light and acting as though nothing unusual had occurred. Where did you learn to? Later, she said for the second time in 30 minutes. Can you feel your hands? 001200. The QRF sergeant came up the stairs at a run and stopped in the doorway of the rooftop when he saw them taking in the scene with the rapid threat assessment scan of a man trained to understand a situation in under 2 seconds. What he saw was a female corporal in a medic's kit kneeling over a downed SEAL operator, a Barrett M82, with a hot barrel lying beside them and 14 pieces of spent brass that told a story he was not equipped to immediately interpret. Who was on this rifle? He asked. I was, Kira said, not looking up from Chun's neurological check. The QRF sergeant looked at the brass again. He looked at the ridgeline. He looked at Kira. He opened his mouth, closed it, and then did what professional soldiers do when a situation exceeds their current framework. He moved on to the next task. We have 3 KIA confirmed on the eastern approach, he said. 2 more on the northern wall. Your element is clear to extract. Lieutenant Dawson wants you downstairs. Chun walks out or he goes on a litter. He doesn't run. Understood. She got Chun to his feet with her shoulder under his arm and walked him down the stairs, and when they came through the doorway and into the daylight, where the rest of the team was assembled around the QRF vehicles, the quality of silence that met them was different from any silence she had experienced in 8 months of operating alongside these men. Reyes was the first one to move. He stepped toward her, started to say something, stopped. His jaw worked. Brock stood with his arms crossed and looked at a point somewhere above her head, which was how Brock processed things that had rearranged his understanding of the world. Dawson stood 12 feet away and looked directly at her, and she could not read his expression, because Dawson had a face that gave away exactly what he intended it to give away and nothing else. He watched her walk Chun toward the QRF medic and hand him off with a brief clinical summary mechanism of injury duration of unconsciousness, neurological findings, vitals at last check. And when she was done and turned around, he was still watching her. "Vaughn," he said, "you and I are going to have a very long conversation when we get back." "Yes, sir," she said. She said it the way she said most things. Quiet, level, without apology or performance. He nodded once and turned away to manage the extraction, and that was how the conversation ended. But it was also how a different and much more complicated conversation began. One that would not take place between Kira and Dawson alone, but would eventually involve people with more authority than a lieutenant and more at stake than a single firefight in Kandahar province. 001800. They flew back to Camp Resolute in 23 minutes. Kira spent 19 of those minutes with Torres, who had held his own wound packing with two-handed pressure for the better part of an hour and had not complained once, which was the kind of behavior that made her proud to be in the same profession as the person she was treating. The wound was clean. The packing had prevented sufficient blood loss. Torres was going to be fine, and he knew it, and he kept trying to ask her about the Barrett, and she kept redirecting him to breathing slowly and maintaining pressure, which was not exactly a medical necessity at that point, but was the most efficient way she had of not answering his questions. Chun sat across from her in the helicopter with his helmet in his lap and his eyes fixed on her with an intensity that she was choosing not to engage with directly. He was running through it. She could see him running through it, going back through every patrol, every equipment check, every time she had loaded his magazines or adjusted his gear, and reassembling the picture with new information that changed everything that had been obvious before. She understood what that felt like. She had done it herself more than once, looking back at her own history. When the helicopter touched down and they moved through the post-mission processing, with the efficient practice mechanics of a team that had done this enough times to know the sequence in their sleep, she kept her head down and her expression neutral and answered the questions she was asked with the precision and economy of someone who had spent 8 months learning how to be invisible in a world full of people trained to notice things. It did not work. 002400. The debrief was in the operations center, a low-ceilinged room that smelled of stale coffee and dry erase markers, and it started as debrief. Always started with Dawson standing at the front, working through the timeline in chronological order, keeping the temperature in the room controlled, the way a good leader keeps the temperature controlled even when the room wants to boil. He got through the initial contact, the vehicle casualties, the loss of Chun's overwatch position. Then he said, at approximately 0857, Corporal Vaughn assumed the overwatch position and engaged with the Barrett M82. The room did not erupt. It did something quieter and in some ways more significant. It went very still in the way that rooms go still when a fact has been stated that reorders everything around it. Reyes was sitting to Kira's left. He turned and looked at her with an expression that contained about 7 different emotions layered on top of each other, the way sediment layers in rock, each one pressed flat by the one that came after it. Brock to her right was staring at the table. Dawson continued. Corporal Vaughn engaged and neutralized a flanking element on the eastern approach, a suppressor position on the northern wall, and subsequently identified and disrupted a long-range threat on the ridgeline, which intelligence assessment now strongly suggests was the individual designated as the Ghost. He paused. She did this in 18 minutes from a cold rifle she had never fired in a combat context under direct fire, while simultaneously managing 2 battlefield casualties. He looked at her. Corporal Vaughn, would you like to tell this team who you are? She had known this was coming. She had known it since the moment she picked up the Barrett, And possibly since before that, since the morning of the briefing, when she had looked at the map and calculated the ghost position and said nothing, because saying nothing was what she had trained herself to do. She looked at Dawson. She looked at the room. "My name is Kira Vaughn," she said. "I'm a Navy corpsman. I've also been a competitive long-range shooter since I was 14. I won the national championship at 16, 17, and 18. My records were omitted from my service jacket at my own request." The silence that followed that statement was its own kind of detonation. Reyes said very quietly, "You won the national championship." "3 times. 3 times." He leaned back in his chair. "And you've been hauling Chun's rifle around for 8 months. Someone had to carry it." What happened next, Kira had not anticipated. She had anticipated questions, operational questions, maybe some anger from Dawson about disclosure and risk in the chain of command. She had anticipated Chun saying something about his rifle. She had anticipated Brock's particular brand of silence, which was the silence of a man recalculating his understanding of someone he thought he had already fully categorized. She had not anticipated Master Chief Raymond Solis walking through the door. Solis was not assigned to their forward element. Solis was based out of the main operations hub, 200 kilometers west, and his presence at Camp Resolute meant that someone considerably higher in the food chain than Lieutenant Dawson had been paying attention to radio traffic that afternoon and had made a phone call, and the phone call had resulted in a Master Chief boarding a helicopter within 90 minutes of the firefight. He was 51 years old. He was built like a piece of equipment rather than a person, and he had the eyes of someone who had been evaluating human capability for so long that he did it the way other people breathe constantly, automatically, without needing to think about it. He sat down across from Kira without preamble or introduction, looked at her for a long moment and said, "Who taught you?" She said, "My father." "Name?" "Chief Warrant Officer David Vaughn, Army. Retired, 75th Ranger Regiment, assigned to JSOC Sniper Cell from 2001 to 2009. Solis did not move. Something happened in his face that was not quite an expression, more like a very rapid internal reorganization, the kind that happens when a piece of information slots into a framework that was already there waiting for it. "David Vaughn," he said. "Yes, sir." "I knew your father." She had not known that. She had not known that, and it landed in her chest with a weight that was not entirely surprise and not entirely recognition, but something in between, the sense of a circle closing that she had not known was open. "He was the best long-range shooter I ever watched work," Solis said, "and I have watched a considerable number of people work." "He was," she said, "he was exceptional." The past tense registered on Solis's face. He did not ask. Some things a man with his experience understands without asking. "How long ago?" he said. 4 years. His heart. Solis nodded once slowly with the gravity of a man who has lost too many people to treat the information lightly, but too many times to be broken by it fresh. "He trained you from the beginning," Solis said. It was not a question. "From when I was 9, she said. "He retired when I was 8. He said he needed something to do with his mornings." Something shifted in the room. Reyes made a small sound that might have been a laugh that he caught before it fully formed. Even Dawson's expression changed slightly, the edges of something that wasn't quite a smile appearing at the corners of a face that had been professionally neutral for the last hour. 003800. Solis leaned forward. "The ridgeline engagement. Tell me exactly what you saw." She told him. She told him about the map that morning, the position calculation, the engagement pattern she'd identified from the previous 3 ambushes. She told him about finding the decoy position and then finding the real one. She told him about the imperfect shot, the shot she had taken knowing it was imperfect because the alternative was taking no shot at all and losing the initiative. Solis listened without interrupting. When she finished, he sat for a moment with his hands flat on the table. "You threw a round at a 1,000-meter target to flush the position," he said. "You accepted a low-probability shot to create a high-probability outcome change." "Yes, sir." "Your father taught you that." He said a perfect shot you don't take is worth nothing. An imperfect shot that changes the geometry is worth everything. Solis was quiet for a beat. He used to say that, almost word for word. He stood up. He looked at Dawson. "Lieutenant, I need your corpsman for 24 hours. Intelligence review, operational assessment. She comes back to your element tomorrow morning. Dawson looked at Kira for a moment, then back at Solus. Understood, Master Chief. Solus looked at Kira. Get your kit. We have a lot to talk about. She stood up. She looked at Reyes, who was watching her with an expression that she could not fully decode, and that she thought she probably needed more time to think about. She looked at Chun, who had been sitting at the end of the table with a field dressing on his head and his Barrett M82 on the table in front of him, and who had not said a single word since the debrief had begun. He looked up at her. Vaughn, he said. Chun, you fired 14 rounds from my rifle. 13 clean and 1 thrown. The thrown one was a tactical decision. He was quiet for a moment. Were any of the 13 clean ones outside of 800 meters? 2 were at approximately 1,060. 1 was at 940. The rest were under 800. Another silence. What was your scope correction for the 1,060 shot? 0.7 mils up, half mil left. Wind had shifted approximately 12 degrees from initial reading between my first shot and that engagement. Chun looked at her for a long time. He had the expression of a man who had just been handed information that required him to rebuild something he'd spent years constructing, and who was doing the construction in real time, and who was not entirely sure how he felt about the result. You could have told me, he said. I know, she said. Why didn't you? She picked up her kit. She looked at him directly, the way she rarely looked at any of them directly, and she told him the truth. Because when people know what you can do, she said, they stop letting you do anything else. And I wanted to be a medic. I like being a medic. I'm good at it. She paused. I'm also good at this. Today was the first time both things have been true at the same time. She walked out of the operations center and the door closed behind her. And in the silence that followed, 7 operators who had spent 8 months not fully seeing the person in front of them sat with that fact and what it meant. 0045 is 00. The 24 hours with Solus were not what she expected. She had expected an assessment, some kind of formal evaluation range time, a series of tests designed to verify what the after-action data had already established. She had expected to be measured. What she got was something that felt in its bones like the opposite of a test. Solus sat across from her in a small room at the main operations hub with 2 cups of coffee between them and a series of photographs spread across the table, satellite imagery, ground-level intelligence photos, a collection of forensic documentation from 6 previous engagements that had been attributed to the ghost. He talked to her the way he talked to an equal, which was something she had not experienced with anyone above her pay grade in the military, and he asked her questions that were not structured to confirm a conclusion he'd already reached, but to genuinely understand how she thought. The ambush today used the same overlapping fire pattern as the engagement 3 weeks ago in Coast, he said. Most people in the analysis chain are reading that as an indication of a fixed tactical doctrine. You identified the ridgeline position from the map before we even rolled out. What were you seeing that the analysts weren't? She thought about how to answer that in a way that was accurate without being difficult. The analysts are looking at the pattern from the outside, she said. They're looking at what the pattern produces: casualties, engagement duration, withdrawal routes. I was looking at what the pattern requires. For that overlapping fire geometry to work, you need a high ground position with clear lines of sight to all 3 of the lower firing positions. That high ground position is also the most vulnerable point in the whole setup. If you know where to look, it's the one place the whole thing depends on. And you knew where to look. I've been setting up that kind of geometry since I was 15, she said, competitively. You build a course of fire and you learn what holds it together and what collapses it. The ghost setup today was elegant, but it had the same structural dependency that any overlapping fire geometry has. I recognized it because I've built it. Solus was quiet for a moment. He was looking at her with something that she was beginning to understand was not evaluation, but recognition. The particular way one specific kind of mind recognizes another specific kind of mind, the way her father had sometimes looked at the range when he watched her correct for wind before the flags had even finished moving. He's going to come back, Solus said. The ghost. He displaced today, but he wasn't neutralized. He knows his position was identified. He's going to spend time, days, maybe a week, analyzing what happened, and then he's going to adapt. I know, she said. He's going to be looking for you. I know that too. Does that change anything for you? She looked at the photographs on the table. She looked at the 6 engagements, the careful documentation of what he'd done and where he'd done it and who had not come home afterward. It changes the problem, she said. It doesn't change whether I want to solve it. Solus nodded. He picked up his coffee. He looked at her over the rim of it with the steady, unhurried attention of a man who had found, after a very long search, the right tool for a very specific problem. Your father would have been proud, he said. Today, what you did today. She did not answer immediately. She let the words sit for a moment because they deserved to sit. He would have wanted to know about the imperfect shot, she said finally. He would have said I should have had a better angle prepared. Solus smiled. It was a small smile, the kind that belongs to people who carry a great deal and can only release it incrementally. He would have said exactly that. And then he would have told every person he trusted what you pulled off today, and he would have pretended he was only mentioning it casually. She looked down at the table for a moment. When she looked back up, her expression was composed, but her eyes were doing something that she could not entirely control, and she did not try to because there was nobody in this room that she needed to be invisible for. Circa 5200. The call came at 2340. She was in the temporary billet running through her medical inventory with the methodical focus that had always been her version of rest. Not sleeping, not thinking about anything, except the work, letting the familiar ritual of check and restock and organize, settle her nervous system the way other people's nervous systems were settled by music or movement. Solus appeared in the doorway. We have a problem, he said. She set down the kit. The problem was this: the intelligence cell had picked up signals traffic in the last 6 hours that suggested the ghost had not gone far. The displacement she'd forced that morning had taken him approximately 3 kilometers east along his ridgeline to a position that intelligence was now assessing as a prepared secondary hide, which meant he had planned for the possibility of being forced off his primary position, which meant the disruption she'd created had not surprised him as much as she'd hoped, which meant he was already adapting. There's more, Solus said. The signals traffic contains some tactical communications that our analysts have been comparing to the previous engagements. There's a target reference in the traffic. A description. He paused. It describes a female shooter in the overwatch position. It describes specific details about her firing pattern. Kira was very still. He was watching me, she said, while you were watching him. She thought about the 53 seconds on the rooftop, the slow scan of the ridgeline, the way she'd found him in the final seconds before she'd fired. She thought about what he had been doing during those same 53 seconds. He was reading my technique, she said, the same way I was reading his position. That's what our analysts believe. She was quiet for a moment. He knows I was trained. He knows I'm not a trained-in-place combat shooter. He knows I'm something else. Yes. And he's going to use that information. He already is, Solus said. The traffic suggests he's going to change his engagement approach for this team. Specifically, he's going to change it based on what he learned about you today. She looked at the kit in her hands. She set it down carefully. Then we have to change it first, she said. Solus looked at her. We. This is my problem now, she said. I made it mine when I picked up that rifle. I'm not going to set it down because it got complicated. He was quiet for a long time, long enough that the only sounds in the room were the ventilation system and the distant, persistent noise of a military base that never truly slept. Then he said, there is something else you need to know. About the ghost. About who he is. She waited. 18 months ago, before we gave him that designation, before he was an intelligence file, he was a man. A sniper. One of the most technically skilled we've encountered in this theater. Solus's voice carried something careful in it, something measured. He was trained by someone we know, someone who spent time in this region in an advisory capacity approximately 8 years ago, training local forces in precision marksmanship. She looked at Solus. She looked at him with the beginning of an understanding that she did not want to be right about, and that she could already feel in the way you feel a thing before you've confirmed it was exactly right. Who trained him, she said. Solus held her gaze. The advisory team leader at that time, he said carefully, was Chief Warrant Officer David Vaughn. The room did not spin. The room did not change. Everything stayed exactly where it was, every object in its exact place, and the only thing that moved was something inside her chest that had been sitting quietly for 4 years and was now shifting with the slow, tectonic weight of a truth that had been buried long enough to become part of the foundation of something. Her father had trained the ghost. She was her father's student. And somewhere on a ridge line 3 kilometers east of where she was sitting, the ghost was looking at everything he had observed about her technique today and recognizing in the architecture of how she moved and thought and shot the same teacher who had built him. He knew who she was, not her name, not her rank, but the thing that mattered more than either, the lineage, the source, the hand that had made them both. She sat with that knowledge for exactly as long as she needed to sit with it. Then she picked up her medical kit, closed it, and set it beside her boots. "Tell me everything you know about him," she said. He talked the way intelligence officers talk when they have decided that full disclosure is the only responsible option, methodically, without decoration, moving through facts in the order that made them most comprehensible rather than most palatable. Kira listened the way her father had taught her to listen to a wind report, without interrupting, absorbing everything, letting the information settle into a usable shape before she tried to do anything with it. The ghost's name, according to the best intelligence available, was Tariq Mansour. 43 years old, former Afghan National Army trained by a coalition advisory team that had rotated through Kandahar province in 2016 and 2017. The advisory team's mission had been straightforward: on paper, build indigenous precision fire capability, transfer skills to local forces, create a sustainable program. Chief Warrant Officer David Vaughn had led the marksmanship instruction component for 14 months. Mansour had been his best student. Kira listened to that without moving. She listened to the description of the man her father had spent 14 months teaching, his patience, his aptitude, the way he absorbed correction without ego, and applied it the next day as though it had always been part of him. Solis was reading from a report compiled from the recollections of team members who had been there, and the language was clinical and bureaucratic, but underneath the language was a portrait that she recognized. She recognized it because it was her portrait too. Her father had spent 40 years finding people who could hold still long enough to see clearly and teaching them what to do with that. After the advisory mission ended, Solis said, Mansour's unit was absorbed into a restructured Afghan National Army armoring element. Things went the way things went after 2019. We lost track of him for about 14 months. When he came back into the intelligence picture, the context had changed entirely. "What changed?" she asked. "His family," Solis said. "During the period we lost track of him, there was an airstrike, a coalition airstrike targeting a compound in Helmand province. The compound was assessed as a weapons storage facility. The assessment was wrong." She was quiet. "His wife," Solis said, "his 2 daughters, his younger brother, they were in the compound." The room was very still. "Nobody came to tell him," Solis said. "Nobody came to explain or apologize or take accountability. He found out from a neighbor 3 days after it happened. By the time any official acknowledgement was forthcoming, he had already disappeared." Kira looked at her hands on the table. She thought about what it would feel like to be David Vaughn's student, to have been given the gift of precision, of clarity, of seeing through distance and wind and uncertainty to the exact point of impact, and then to have that gift turn in your hands because the people who gave it to you destroyed everything you were using it to protect. She thought about that for exactly as long as she needed to think about it. "He's not fighting for ideology," she said. "No. He's fighting because there's nothing left to fight for except the fighting itself." Solis looked at her carefully. "That's the current assessment." "Yes. And my father knew him. My father taught him, and my father is dead." She paused. "Does Mansour know my father is dead?" "We don't know. Because if he doesn't know," she said slowly, "then what he saw today on that rooftop, the technique, the geometry, the way I shoot, he didn't just see a skilled operator. He saw David Vaughn's fingerprints on someone new. He saw that his teacher is still out there, still producing." Solis set down his coffee cup. "That's a significant analytical leap." "It's what I would think," she said, "if I were him." 010200. She did not sleep that night. Not because she was afraid and not because the information Solis had given her was too heavy to rest under, but because her mind was doing what her mind always did when it was given a real problem. It was working the geometry. She lay on her cot in the temporary billet and she ran through everything she knew about Mansour's shooting pattern, Everything she'd observed in the 3 seconds between finding him and pulling the trigger on that imperfect shot, and she built a model of him the way her father had taught her to build a model of any shooter she was going to engage at distance. You are not shooting at a target, her father had said on a cold morning in Montana when she was 16, and the wind was doing complicated things, and she was frustrated. You are shooting at a decision. Find the decision, and you find the shot. Mansour's decision architecture was precise and conservative. He prepared multiple positions. He used decoys. He was patient enough to wait through a prolonged engagement round before taking a shot, which meant he had the psychological discipline to hold tension without releasing it prematurely. That was rare. That was something her father had spent years trying to build in her, and she had come to it naturally but not without work. Mansour had come to it naturally too. She could see it in the pattern. She could see her father in it the same way you can sometimes see a teacher's syntax in a student's writing the logic underneath the style. The thing that was keeping her awake was not the tactical problem. It was the question of what she was going to do if she found him in her scope and understood in that moment exactly who he was and what had been done to him and still had to make the decision. She thought about her father. She thought about the conversations they'd had in the last year of his life when he was already sick, and he would sometimes talk about the advisory mission in Afghanistan with a heaviness that she had attributed to general wartime weight and had never fully examined. She wondered now what he had known, what he had carried. She got up at 0400 and went to find Solis. 010800. He was already awake. She suspected he had not slept either. She sat down across from him and said, "I need to go back to my team. I told Dawson tomorrow morning. I mean now, I need to be there when they wake up. There are things I need to say to those men, and I need to say them before the operational tempo picks up and the moment passes." Solis looked at her for a moment. "What kind of things?" "The kind that needs saying," she said simply. He arranged the transport. At 0515, she was back at Camp Resolute, and she walked into the team's berthing area, while most of them were still in various stages of the particular grim ritual of military morning, shaving inventory, the silent coffee drinking that served as the transitional state between sleep and functionality. Reyes saw her first. He straightened, then Brock, then Torres, who was on light duty with his shoulder dressed, and who gave her a look that was approximately 80% relief and 20% something she didn't have a word for. Chun was sitting on the edge of his kanet with the Barrett field stripped in front of him, reassembling it with the automatic precision of long practice. He looked up when she came in. Dawson was standing at the window with his back to the room. He turned. She stood in the middle of the room, and she did something that did not come naturally to her, because it required a kind of exposure that she had spent a long time deliberately avoiding. She told them the truth, not the abridged version she had given in the debrief, the full version. She told them about her father, not just that he had trained her, but who he had been and what he had given her and what it had meant to carry that skill without being able to use it the way you carry something valuable in a place no one can see, protecting it and being protected by it, and sometimes unable to tell the difference between the two. She told them that she had hidden it deliberately and that she had hidden it because she had watched what happened to people when their usefulness became too specific, when they became their function rather than themselves, and she had not wanted that. She had wanted to be Kira von N. Corman. She had wanted to take care of people. She told them that today had not changed that. She was still a Corman. She was not asking to be reclassified or reassigned. She was asking them to understand something about who she was that she should have found a way to communicate before a firefight forced the issue. When she finished, the room was quiet for a long moment. Then Reyes said, "You saved my life today." "You would have found cover," she said. "I was pinned behind the wheel of a burning vehicle, and there was a machine gun position on the north wall that had me dialed in. I was not going to find cover." His voice was completely level, which was the way Reyes got when something had hit him too deep for the usual deflection. "You took that position out from 900 meters with a rifle you'd never fired in combat. You saved my life. I need you to hear that." She looked at him. "I hear it." Brock, who had said nothing since she'd come back, uncrossed his arms. He had the expression of a man who had arrived at a conclusion that had cost him something to reach. I've been sitting with this since yesterday, he said, trying to figure out why it bothers me. And I think what bothers me is that I missed it. 8 months. I'm supposed to be someone who doesn't miss things, and I looked at you every day for 8 months and didn't see it. He paused. That's on me, not you. You saw what I showed you, she said. That's a generous way to put it. It's an accurate way. 11800, Chun had not spoken. He finished reassembling the Barrett, set it down, and looked at her directly. I want to shoot with you, he said. Not against you, not with me as primary and you hauling my gear. With you as a two-person element. She hadn't expected that. She had expected adjustment. She had not expected generosity. That's Dawson's call, she said. I know it is. Chun looked at Dawson. Lieutenant, Dawson had been watching the entire exchange with the controlled attention of a man filing everything he was seeing away for later assessment. He was quiet for a moment after Chun spoke. Then he looked at Kira. Solas called me at 0430, he said. He told me about your father. He told me about Mansour. He paused. He told me you were coming back early and he thought I should know why before you got here. She said nothing. This is personal for you now, Dawson said. I need to know that's not going to affect your judgment in the field. It's going to inform my judgment, she said. It's not the same thing. Explain the difference to me. Personal means you make decisions based on what you feel. Informed means you make decisions based on what you know. I know more about Mansour now than I did yesterday. That's an asset, not a liability. She held his gaze. If I thought it was going to compromise me, I would tell you. You have my word. Another silence. The kind that has the weight of a decision being made in it. Chun, Dawson said. She shoots with you as primary two-person element, effective immediately. Vaughn retains full medical authority and duties. Anyone who has a problem with this arrangement can come see me privately, and I will explain why their problem is incorrect. He looked around the room once. Questions. Nobody spoke. Good, he said. Get ready. We have a briefing at 0700, 012600. The 0700 briefing was not a routine patrol debrief. Solas was present again via secure video feed from the main hub, and the intelligence he brought with him had changed the operational picture significantly in the 12 hours since the ambush. The signals traffic from the previous night had been run through analysis. There were 3 items of significance. First, Mansour had established contact with a larger insurgent network, not ideological based on the assessment, but transactional. He was providing precision fire support in exchange for logistics, positioning, and local intelligence. Second, the network he was working with had 3 specific coalition targets on an active list, and SEAL Team 6's forward element was on that list by unit designation, not by individual. Third, the signals traffic had contained a phrase that the analysis cell had flagged as possibly referential, a phrase in Pashto that translated roughly as the student of the teacher. Kira heard that phrase and felt something move through her that was not fear, but was adjacent to the temperature of fear. He knew. Not her name, not necessarily, but he had seen enough in those 18 minutes on the rooftop to identify the teaching, her father's teaching, and he had named it in his communications the way you name a thing you're preparing yourself to face. Dawson looked at her. She looked back at him steadily. He's going to come for this team specifically, Solas said through the screen. The targeting is no longer random or opportunistic. He knows something new is operating in this element, and he's going to find it and neutralize it before it has time to develop into a sustained threat to his operational freedom. So we need to move before he does, Reyes said. We need to do more than move, Kira said. Every head in the room turned toward her. We need to invite him, 013400. The silence that followed that statement was the kind that happens when someone says something that sounds dangerous and might also be right, and the room hasn't yet determined which quality to respond to first. Dawson said, explain. He's going to set up an engagement on his terms, she said. He's going to pick the ground, the position, the timing. He's been doing that for 19 months, and it's worked 19 months in a row, and it will work again unless we change the variable he's not accounting for. Which is, Dawson said, he knows my technique. He studied it yesterday. He's going to build his approach around what he observed, my firing pattern, my position selection, how I displaced. She paused. He doesn't know that I know he was watching. He thinks he gathered intelligence without giving any away. Because you fired an imperfect shot, Chun said slowly. He thinks you didn't see him. He thinks I fired at a position I was guessing at. He doesn't know I found him. She looked at the map on the table. If we can construct a situation where he believes he has the initiative, where he thinks he's setting the terms of the engagement, and we've already seen through the construction, we can put him in a position he hasn't prepared for. You want to bait him, Brock said. I want to give him what he thinks he wants, she said. A sniper duel on his terms, and make sure his terms are actually ours. The room was very quiet. Solis's voice came through the screen. Vaughn, this requires you to be the visible element. You would be the thing he's targeting. I know. That is a significant personal risk. It's also the fastest and cleanest way to end this, she said. If he's transactional, if he's working for a network, then his operational effectiveness is dependent on his continued survival. He knows that. He's been careful for 19 months because he knows that. If we can put him in a position where his own planning is what exposes him, he won't have a prepared exit. And if your read on his technique is wrong, Dawson said, then I'm wrong and we adapt, she said. But I don't think I'm wrong. Dawson looked at her for a long time. He had the expression of a man weighing several things simultaneously: tactical risk, personal risk, operational value, and something harder to quantify that had to do with the particular quality of certainty in her voice. What do you need, he said. She told him. 014200. The plan was simple, the way complex things become simple when they're built correctly. It used three elements: terrain, timing, and truth. The terrain was a dry valley 2 kilometers northeast of Camp Resolute, flanked by a ridgeline on the north that Kira had identified as offering 3 natural hide positions to a sniper approaching from Mansour's last known location. She had identified those positions not by looking at the map and calculating where she would go, though she had done that too, but by asking a different question. She had asked where her father would have placed a student who needed to demonstrate their understanding of ground. The answer came back immediately and clearly, as her father's teachings always had. The timing was noon, when the sun was positioned to create glare from the south that would affect any optic aimed in that direction, a factor that would influence how Mansour chose his position and angle. The truth was the bait, a deliberate signals communication run through the intelligence cell that referenced the female shooter in a way that was designed to suggest she would be at a specific location conducting a skills assessment, an official communication. The kind of thing that, if Mansour's intelligence network was as good as the evidence suggested, would reach him within 6 hours and would read as genuine rather than constructed, because it would be embedded in the actual operational administrative traffic of the base, not inserted separately. Solely signed off on it without hesitation. Whatever calculation he was running about the relative risks of this approach versus alternatives, he had completed it before she finished explaining. Chun built the plan's tactical architecture with her for 3 hours. The two of them hunched over the map table while the rest of the team moved through preparation. And in those 3 hours, something changed between them that had nothing to do with the plan and everything to do with what the plan required: a level of mutual trust in each other's judgment that they had not had yesterday, because yesterday they had not known what there was to trust. At this position, she said, pointing to the leftmost of the 3 natural hides she'd identified, he can cover my likely shooting position, but his extraction route requires crossing 40 meters of open ground. He won't take that position. He takes the center one, Chun said. No, the center one has better concealment, but the soil composition, look at the satellite imagery. You can see the drainage pattern. It's soft. It won't support a prone position cleanly at this time of year. He'll sink 3 inches. He's too experienced to take a position he hasn't physically tested. Chun stared at the image. So the right one. The right one, natural rock-based solid footing, clear sight line to my position, 2 extraction routes, neither of which is visible from my firing position. She paused, which makes it feel perfect, which is exactly the problem. Chun looked up. What's the problem with perfect? The right position is 980 meters from where I'll be, she said. At that range, with the midday light conditions and the glare factor, he's going to have approximately a 4-second window of clean sight on in my position between natural light shifts. He'll calculate that the window is tight and that I won't expect a shot taken in a 4-second window. He'll take the shot in the window. Yes. And you'll be gone before the window opens. Yes. And where will you be? She put her finger on a point on the map that was not one of the three positions she had described. It was behind and to the left of where Mansour would be, at an elevation that he would not have assessed as a firing position because it required crossing 200 meters of broken ground to reach it, and the sight line from that position to his hide was partially obstructed by a rock formation. Partially, not fully. You can shoot through the obstruction, Chun said. There's a gap in the rock formation approximately 30 centimeters wide at the specific elevation I'll be shooting from. If I'm exactly where I need to be, I have a clear path. She paused. 760 meters. Wind from the west. I'll have a clean firing solution from the moment he settles into his position. Chun was quiet for a long moment. He won't see you until it's too late. That's the idea. What if he picks a different position? If he picks the left position, I have a backup firing solution at longer range with a more challenging angle. If he picks the center position, you'll have a clean shot from the support element we're leaving on the southern ridge. She looked at Chun, but he won't pick either of those. He'll pick the right one, because it's the position my father would have told him to pick. 015200. They stepped off at 10:45 the next morning. The team moved in a modified formation that looked to any intelligence being gathered on their movement like a standard patrol with a skills assessment component, which was exactly what the communication traffic had described. Kira moved in her medic roll kit on her back, and only Chun and Dawson knew the full shape of what was about to happen. Reyes knew enough. He had asked her the night before whether she was scared. She had thought about it honestly before answering. Not of him, she said. Not of the engagement. What scares me is the same thing that's always scared me about shooting. The moment after you break the trigger, when the bullet is already on its way and you can't change anything. The complete commitment of it. Reyes had looked at her for a moment. Your dad used to scare you with that. He used to say that every shot is a permanent decision. Once it's gone, it belongs to the world and not to you anymore. She paused. He was talking about technique, about the importance of certainty before you engage. But I've always thought about it the other way too. What other way? That there's something honest about it, she said. You can't take it back. You have to be sure before you go, which means you have to do the work before the moment arrives. The shot is just the result of everything that came before it. Reyes had been quiet for a while. And you've done the work. I've spent my whole life doing the work, she said. Now moving across the dry terrain toward the valley with the sun climbing toward its midday position, she was not afraid. She was the thing that exists on the other side of fear when you have prepared correctly a clarity that is not the absence of feeling, but the resolution of it all, the competing frequencies settled into a single clean signal. She split from the main element at 11:20, crossing to her approach route with Chun's eyes tracking her until terrain took her out of his sight. She moved alone low with the patience she had inherited from her father, taking the broken ground in stages rather than rushing it. She reached her position at 11:43. She got behind the Barrett, squared her cheek on the stock, and found the gap in the rock formation with the optic. She dialed in the firing solution. Wind 9 miles per hour, slightly southwest. Elevation correction adjusted. Distance to target position, 762 meters. She breathed. She waited. At 11:57, she heard very faintly through the rock, in the distance, and the dry, ambient noise of the terrain, the sound of a stone shifting under weight. He was there. She moved her scope by 3 degrees, and she found him entering the hide position, a figure moving with the careful, deliberate economy of a man who had trained himself to be invisible, and who believed in this moment that he was succeeding. She watched him settle. She watched him orient his weapon toward the position where she was supposed to be. She watched a man trained by her father look for her in exactly the place her father would have told him to look. And she understood in that moment with a completeness that had no room left in it for ambiguity or delay that her father had not known what he was building when he built this man. He had been trying to protect something. He had been trying to give someone the tools to survive in a world that was already trying to take everything from him. And the world had taken it anyway, and now she was the instrument of the consequence. She put the crosshairs on his position. She breathed out slow and long. She felt a trigger against her finger, that familiar pressure point that her father had first described to her when she was 9 years old on a cold hillside in Montana, that threshold between intention and permanence. And then something happened that she had not planned for. He stopped moving. He had been settling into position, establishing himself, and then he simply stopped. And he turned his rifle not toward her supposed location. He turned it toward a different vector entirely, toward Chun's support element on the southern ridge. She had 3 seconds. He had found Chun. Somehow, in the process of moving into his position, or before it, or through intelligence, she didn't know about, he had found the secondary element. He was going to take Chun before he looked for her. He was going to remove the threat he'd identified before dealing with the unknown. 3 seconds. She made the decision in 0. She fired. The shot broke at 11:59 and 41 seconds, and for the next 2 seconds, which were the longest 2 seconds of Kira Vaughn's life, the world held its breath. She cycled the bolt without lifting her cheek from the stock, the way her father had drilled into her, 10,000 times until the motion lived in her hands and not in her thinking. And she reacquired the target position through the optic and found disruption in the hide brush. Moved position, broken the careful geometry of a prepared sniper's nest, suddenly disarranged, and she did not know yet whether she had hit him or whether she had hit close enough that he had abandoned the position for the same reason he had abandoned the ridgeline 2 days ago. She did not know, and not knowing was the worst part. "Chun," she said into the radio, her voice level in a way that cost her something to maintain. "Chun, talk to me." A silence that lasted 1 second, 2, 3. Then Chun's voice, and it was the most useful sound she had ever heard in her life. "I'm here. I'm good. What just happened?" "He had you," she said. "He pivoted to your position. I engaged." A pause. "Did you arm? I don't know yet. Position is broken, he's displaced. I need you to hold where you are and do not silhouette. Do you hear me? Do not silhouette." "Holding," Chun said. "Brock is with me. We're both flat. Nobody's moving." She was already scanning, moving the optic across the terrain in a careful, methodical arc, looking for the thing that would tell her what she needed to know. Movement, blood trace, a secondary position being taken up. The hide he had used was empty. She could confirm that much. The question was whether he was empty because he was running or empty because he was relocating. A man who was hit ran differently than a man who was repositioning. She looked for that difference. 020200. Dawson's voice came through on the command channel. "Vaughn, report. Engage target at 11:59. Target position is broken. Current status unknown." "I need 2 minutes." "You have 90 seconds, Dawson said. "Then I'm pulling the element." She did not respond. She was using the time. At the 60-second mark, she found it. Not movement. The absence of movement, specifically a stillness in a particular spot, 40 meters east of the original hide, that was wrong in the way a prepared position is wrong, the kind of stillness that is too deliberate to be natural. A man lying flat in terrain that did not naturally have anything lying flat in it. He was there. He had displaced 30 seconds after she fired, covering 40 meters, in the kind of time that told her the displacement had been fast and not entirely controlled. Not the measured, purposeful movement of a sniper executing a planned position change, but something more reactive, something that had been pushed rather than chosen. She had hit him, or she had come close enough that his body had made a decision his mind hadn't finished making yet. Either way, he was there. He was alive. And he was right now completing a new firing solution on a position that she needed to vacate before he finished it. She moved, not fast. Fast was wrong. Fast created noise and movement signatures that an experienced observer could track. She moved the way she had learned to move on the ranges outside Billings in the competitive stalking exercises her father had designed that were brutal and precise, and that had seemed at 16 like an unnecessary additional layer of difficulty on top of everything else, and that she now understood had been the most important part of everything she had ever been taught. She moved slow and low and deliberate, covering the first 30 meters in approximately 90 seconds. And when Dawson's voice came back on the radio to pull the element, she was already at a secondary position, and she keyed her mic and said, "I have eyes on target. Stand by." "Vaughn." "Stand by," she said, and she put her eye back to the scope. 020800. What she saw in the optics stopped her cold. He was still there in the secondary position she had identified, but he was not behind his rifle. He was on his side, and his right arm was moving in a way that was wrong, too small, too constrained, and she understood what she was looking at before she had consciously assembled all the components of the picture. He was hit. The shot had not been a miss and not been a kill. It had been the worst possible outcome from a pure operational standpoint, a wounding hit that had compromised his position without ending the threat, which meant that right now he was in pain and he was experienced and he was with every second that passed, making the calculation about whether to continue the engagement or withdraw. A man in that position was unpredictable in a way that a healthy man was not. "He's hit," she said into the radio. "Right side arm or shoulder, I can't confirm at this distance. He's still in the field and he still has his weapon. I need the team to hold." Dawson's voice was very quiet. Vaughn, what is your current position relative to his 700 meters northeast? I have a sight line, but the angle is poor. I need him to move. And if he doesn't move, then he's going to try to hold his current position until dark, and after dark, we lose him." A long pause on the radio. She could hear the weight of the calculation in it. "What do you need?" Dawson said. She told him, 02-15-00. What she needed was for someone to give Mansour a reason to reposition in the next 10 minutes. Not an attack, not a direct engagement that would tell him where the main element was and give him a target. Something else. Something that would introduce uncertainty into his calculation without resolving it the way wind introduces uncertainty into a firing solution, not stopping you, but making you move to a position where the variable is smaller. Reyes did it. Reyes, who had grown up in the Mojave and understood terrain, the way people who grow up in difficult places understand the specific texture of the world they were raised in, moved on his own authority to a position on the western approach, where his radio traffic would create a signal that Mansour's intelligence network, if it was still active and monitoring, would receive as an element advancing from that direction. It was not a feint in the traditional sense. It was more like a suggestion, a gentle pressure on the geometry of the situation. It worked. At 12:14, Mansour moved. He moved east, which she had predicted, because east kept the sun at his back and gave him better light management for his optic, and because east was also the direction that led toward the extraction route his network maintained through the village system in the valley below the ridgeline. He moved slowly. His right arm was compromised. She could see it in how he carried himself, the asymmetry of a person managing pain while trying not to let the pain change how they move. She moved with him, parallel, maintaining her distance, keeping her angle. She was tracking him the way you track something through difficult terrain when you cannot afford to lose it, but cannot yet close the distance, reading ahead, anticipating putting herself in the place he was going rather than the place he was. Her father had a name for this. He called it following the intention rather than the action. You watch someone long enough to understand what they're trying to do, and then you stop watching them and start watching the destination. She put herself in his destination. At 12:22, he stopped. 2:23:00. He had found a third position. She had not anticipated this one, and that fact sat in her chest with a cold clarity that she held on to rather than suppressing, because the feeling of being wrong was information. It told her something about the gap between her model of how he thought and how he actually thought. The third position was behind her original calculations. It was not in the terrain she had assessed as viable for a prepared hide. It was in a section of the ridge line that looked, from the satellite imagery she had studied, too exposed on the approach vector to be usable. But he had found something she hadn't: a fold in the ground, a depression that the satellite imagery flattened into invisibility that gave him a firing position with better concealment than anything she had identified. He was adapting under fire with a wounded arm at distance against a threat he had not expected. She felt in that moment something that was complicated, and that she did not have the luxury of sitting with, a recognition that crossed the tactical and became briefly uncomfortably personal. This was a man her father had made. This was the thing her father had built with 14 months of patience and instruction, and it was extraordinary, and it had been turned into a weapon by a grief that nobody had bothered to acknowledge, and it was now aiming itself at people she was responsible for keeping alive. She sighted in. He was 690 meters away, her wounded arm shot, clean angle, wind minimal at this distance. She was about to take the shot when his radio crackled. Not her radio, his. She heard it, a brief burst of voice communication too distant and too compressed to decode the words, but the sound of it carried across the still air in a way that the terrain was occasionally capable of conducting sound when the temperature differentials were right. He stopped what he was doing. He listened. And then he did something she had not expected. He put his rifle down, not dropped it, set it down, with the deliberate care of a person who was making a decision rather than responding to an emergency. She kept her crosshairs on him, and she watched and she did not fire because something about what she was observing was information that she did not yet understand, and firing before she understood it felt like a mistake she would not be able to take back. He reached for the radio at his chest. He spoke into it. She heard his voice. She could not hear the words, but she heard the tone of it, not tactical, not commanding, something else, something that had a different register entirely. He looked up, not at her position, up at the sky, the way people look when they are not looking at anything specific, but are looking at everything at once. Then he picked up his rifle again, 02-3100. Vaughn! Solis's voice appeared on the command channel. He was monitoring from the hub. We just intercepted his communications. Stand by for translation, she waited. He received a report, Solis said, from his network contact in the village. The report identified you by name. She held very still. Not your rank, not your unit, your name. Kira Vaughn. And your father's name. Opaz Bonan. His network found your service record. The unredacted version from a source we have not yet identified. He knows whose student you are. She thought about what she had observed. Him setting the rifle down, looking at the sky, the tone of his voice in the radio communication. She thought about what a person does when they receive information that rewrites the framework of an engagement they are in the middle of, when the target they have been preparing to kill suddenly becomes something more complicated than a target. He had known her father. He had spent 14 months being shaped by her father's mind and her father's patience, and now he was in a ridgeline in Kandahar province being hunted by that same mind, reproduced in a different body, and whatever he was feeling about that, it was not simple. Solis, she said, I need to know something. Did Mansour know my father was dead? A pause. The report he received included that information. Yes, she breathed. He had just found out. Right now, in the middle of this engagement, with a wound in his arm and his position identified and everything going wrong right now, was when he found out that the man who had given him the most valuable thing he had ever been given was gone. She thought about what that felt like. She already knew what that felt like. Vaughn, Dawson said, what is your status? I have a clean shot, she said, requesting 30 seconds. You have 30 seconds. 02-3800. She used 28 of them. She used them to do something that was not in any training manual, and that she would not have been able to justify tactically, and that she was going to do anyway because there were moments when the only right decision was the one that accounted for the full weight of what was happening rather than only the operational component of it. She keyed to the frequency that Solis's team had identified as Mansour's communications channel. She said in Pashto the 3 words her father had taught her when she was 17, because he had said that any shooter operating in this part of the world needed to know how to say at minimum this one thing clearly. She said, I see you, not as a threat. In Pashto, those words had a layered meaning. They could be tactical, but they could also be something else entirely. Something her father had explained to her with the patience of a man who had spent 14 months in a different culture learning in what language actually meant when it left the dictionary and entered the world. They could mean, I understand what you are. Silence on the frequency, then after 11 seconds, a voice. His voice in Pashto, rough with pain and something else. He said, the old man taught you. She said yes. He said he is gone. She said yes. 4 years. A silence that went on long enough that she thought he had left the channel. Then, he never told me he had a daughter who could shoot. She said, he never told me he had a student who could disappear. Another silence. Then something she had not expected, had not allowed herself to expect, because it was the kind of thing you don't expect in the middle of a tactical operation with a wounded enemy at the other end of your scope. She heard him very faintly make a sound that was not language and not tactical. And that was the most honest thing she had heard from another human being in 8 months of operating in this country. He was grieving. Right now, 690 meters away from her, with his arm wounded and his position identified, and his entire operational situation compromised, Tariq Mansour had just learned that the man who had given him the only good thing remaining in his life, after everything else was taken, was dead, and he was grieving it in the middle of a firefight because there was no other time available. She kept the crosshairs on him. She breathed, 024600. Vaughn, Dawson's voice. Time. 1 more minute, she said. That is not 1 minute, Lieutenant, please. The please was not something she had planned. It came out because it was true. Because she needed 60 more seconds, and she could not explain why in tactical language, and the closest word available was please. A pause. 59 seconds, Dawson said. And then the radio went quiet, which was its own kind of answer. She said into Mansour's channel, "He would have hated this. What we are doing right now." A long pause. Then an accented but precise English that had the specific cadence of someone who had learned it from an American instructor, rather than from a textbook. "He would have sat us both down and made us shoot at the same target until we understood each other." Her chest did something complicated. "He did that to me once," she said, "when I was 16. I was convinced a fellow competitor was positioning wrong on purpose to affect my wind read. My father made us shoot side by side for 3 hours until I understood he was dealing with a tremor in his left hand and compensating. He did the same to me," Mansour said, "with 2 of my soldiers who did not trust each other. He made them share a firing position for an entire afternoon." Another pause. "They became friends." She breathed. "Tariq, I'm not going to tell you that what was done to your family was right. It wasn't. I'm not going to tell you that the people responsible have been held accountable. Some of them haven't. I'm not going to tell you anything that isn't true." Silence. "But I'm going to tell you that what we're doing right now, this is not what he made us for. Either of us." The silence stretched out long enough that her 30 seconds remaining became 15. Then Mansour said, "He told me once that the rifle is only as clean as the reason you carry it." She felt the words land somewhere deep. "He told me the same thing," she said. 025400. What happened in the next 40 seconds was not in the plan, and it was not something Kira could have predicted, and it was the thing that she would spend the rest of her career, and she suspected the rest of her life, understanding the full weight of. Mansour stood up, not into a fighting posture, not into a movement posture. He stood up straight in the open at 690 meters in full view of her optic, and he set his rifle down on the ground in front of him, and he put his hands away from his body. She stared. On the command channel, she heard Dawson's voice, very controlled. "Vaughn, what is happening?" "He's standing down," she said, and even as she said it, she was not entirely sure she believed it. "Is this a tactic?" She looked at him through the scope. She looked at the way he was standing, the particular quality of exhaustion in a body that has been carrying something for a very long time and has just put it down. She looked at his wounded arm and the way he was holding it now, no longer the controlled management of pain, but the unguarded expression of it, as though the decision he had just made had released something that had been held in tension throughout his entire body. "No," she said, "it's not a tactic." Dawson was quiet for 2 seconds. "I'm sending Reyes and Brock to that position. Vaughn, maintain your sight line. If anything changes, I'll know," she said. She kept the Barrett trained on him while Reyes and Brock moved across the terrain. She watched Mansour stand still and wait for them, and she thought about what kind of decision that was, to have been the ghost for 19 months, to have been invisible and relentless and feared, and then to choose to become visible. To become something other than the grief and the weapon the grief had made. She thought about her father. She thought about what he would say. She thought he would say, "The shot you don't take is still a decision. Make it as carefully as the ones you do." 030100. Reyes reached Mansour's position at 1247. She heard the transmission terse professional, the sound of a well-trained operator managing a situation that had no clean procedural template. She heard Reyes confirm the weapon secured. She heard him confirm the wound. She heard briefly the sound of 2 men who did not share a language finding the minimal common vocabulary of a medical situation, because wounds are wounds in any language, and Reyes had been around enough of them to know the basics. She let out a breath that she had been holding in some form since 11:59. She lay behind the Barrett for another 3 minutes scanning the surrounding terrain with the methodical patience of someone who understood that the moment after a thing resolves is exactly the moment when the next thing begins, and that dropping your attention too early was how situations that were almost finished became situations that weren't finished at all. Then she rose, collected her kit, and began moving toward the extraction point. Dawson met her 200 meters from Mansour's position. He looked at her face for a moment, reading something there, and then he did something she did not expect from a man with 8 deployments and a temperament that had never learned patience. He nodded, once, slowly. The nod of a man acknowledging something he does not entirely understand but has decided to respect. "You want to tell me how that ended the way it ended," he said. "I talked to him," she said. "You talked to him?" "Yes, sir." "On his frequency?" "Yes, sir." Dawson looked at the middle distance for a moment. "Master Chief Solace is going to have questions about the communications protocol on this one." "I expect so." "He's also," Dawson said, and something shifted very slightly in his voice, "going to have to find a way to put in a recommendation that covers what you did today, and I don't think the existing forms have a box for it." She said nothing. "Vaughn, you ended a 19-month threat that has cost this coalition 14 operators. You did it without a fatality on either side. You did it in a way that no tactical manual accounts for." He looked at her. "How are you?" The question surprised her, not because it was unexpected from a human being, but because it was unexpected from Dawson, who had a professional vocabulary of about 40 words and used most of them at high volume. "I'm okay," she said. "I'm thinking about my father." Dawson nodded. He'd have something to say about all of this. But he'd have a great deal to say, she said. Yeah, most of it about the imperfect shot on day 1 on 030800. Reyes had field-dressed Mansour's wound by the time she reached the position. The injury was what she had suspected, a through and through on the outer right shoulder. Significant tissue damage, blood loss that was serious but had been slowing on its own, nothing that wasn't going to respond to proper surgical management. She took over from Reyes without ceremony, her hands moving with the professional efficiency that was the oldest part of who she was, and she treated the man who had been trying to kill her team 4 days ago with exactly the same precision and care she brought to every casualty. Mansour watched her work. He did not speak for the first several minutes, and neither did she. There was a quality to the silence between them that was not comfortable but was not hostile. Something more like the silence between two people who have said important things to each other and are now in the process of living in the aftermath of those things. Then he said in English, "You shoot exactly like him." She did not look up from the wound. "I know. The way you hold your breath before the break. The way you compensate for wind before the flags move." He paused. "I used to practice by trying to predict his adjustments before he made them. I was wrong more often than I was right. He got faster every year," she said. "He said it was the only thing that improved with age." "He told me the opposite," Mansour said. "He told me that speed came from practice and that wisdom came from patience, and that the two things were always in tension." She looked up at him briefly. "He told you both things, to see which answer you were looking for." Something moved in Mansour's expression. He was always testing. "Always," she said. Brock was standing 6 feet away watching this exchange with the expression of a man who has decided to stop trying to make something fit the categories he arrived with and is simply letting it be what it is. He met Kira's eyes once. She read something in his face that might from a different person have been called an apology. From Brock it read more like a reckoning, a man squaring a debt against himself. She turned back to the wound. 031600. The extraction took 40 minutes. Mansour was transported under custody to the main operations hub, where the intelligence process would begin, and Kira understood that her involvement in that process was likely, and that it would require her to navigate a level of institutional complexity that made the tactical problem she had just solved look straightforward by comparison. She understood that. She was prepared for it. What she was not prepared for was what happened when they got back to Camp Resolute and she walked into the operations center and found Solace waiting for her, not with paperwork or a debrief agenda, but with something she had not expected from a Master Chief who she had known for 48 hours. He was standing with a piece of paper in his hand. Physical paper, which was unusual in an age when everything was digital, and which told her before she could read a word of it that someone had wanted this communication to be handled in a way that left less trace than a server. He handed it to her. She read it. The letterhead was from a JSOC personnel command element. The content was brief. It informed Corporal Kira Vaughn that effective upon completion of current operational review, her personnel classification was being reviewed for reassignment, and that she was being considered for a position that the document described as Precision Fire Specialist Integrated Medical Element, with a secondary designation she had not encountered before in any official paperwork. She read the secondary designation twice. Lead Sniper SEAL Team 6 East Theater. She looked up at Solace. He said, "You can say no. Can I keep the medical designation?" He looked at her for a moment. "That is not a question I expected. It's the question I have." The short answer is yes. The full answer is that nobody in this building has ever been asked to hold both designations simultaneously, and so the full answer requires some people to make some calls and update some forms. "Then tell them to make the calls and update the forms," she said. He took the paper back from her. He looked at it for a moment, and then he did the thing she had first noticed about him 48 hours ago when he had walked into the debrief room and sat down across from her and asked who had taught her. He looked at her with the direct, unhurried attention of a man who had found the right answer to a question he had been working for a long time. "Your father," he said, "would have been completely insufferable about this." She felt something unlock in her chest that had been locked for a long time. "Yes," she said, "he absolutely would have." She thought about a man who had been given a gift and had carried it through the worst thing that can happen to a person, and who had put down his rifle in the open air at 690 meters because a voice on a radio had said something true. She thought about her father, who had built both of them and who had not lived to see what they could become. "Yes," she said, "it's permanent." Reyes nodded slowly. He drank his coffee. Outside the base, the Afghan night was doing what it always did, vast and cold and indifferent, holding everything that had happened in it with the complete neutrality of a place that had seen centuries of human urgency and had never once been changed by any of it. The board concluded at 1400. Solis walked out with her, and they stood in the corridor with the particular quality of aftermath that exists after a formal process has concluded, and the informal reality is still pending. "How do you think it went?" he said. "I think they're going to approve the reassignment," she said. "And I think at least one of those officers is going to spend the next week trying to decide how he feels about the radio communication." "He already decided," Solis said. "He decided before you finished explaining it. He just needs time to let the paperwork catch up with the decision." She looked at him. "You knew these people before today." "I've known Colonel Barrett for 11 years. He ran a sniper program in Mosul in 2009 that your father consulted on." He paused. "Your father and Barrett argued for 3 days about the relative value of patience versus aggression in a target engagement. Your father believed patience was always the higher discipline. Barrett believed that in practice the distinction collapsed under time pressure. Who won the argument?" Solis almost smiled. "Your father, as usual. By demonstration rather than debate, he spent the 3rd day showing Barrett that every engagement Barrett considered time-pressured had on analysis contained a decision point where patience would have improved the outcome." He looked at her. "Today, you gave him a live example of that argument that he's been sitting with for 15 years. She processed that for a moment. "He asked me if I was confident," she said. "He knew you weren't. He wanted to hear how you described the space between confidence and action. That's the argument he and your father were having. What do you call the thing that moves you when the data isn't complete?" "My father called it listening," she said. "He said the rifle tells you things if you've been paying attention long enough." Solis was quiet for a moment. "Barrett is going to want to talk to you, privately outside of the review process. He's not going to say that today, but he will say it within a week. About my father. About a great many things," so Solis said. "Your father touched a lot of people in this theater. More than you know. More than he knew, I think." She went to find Dawson that evening, not because she had been summoned, and not because there was official business remaining. The official business had been concluded, but because there was something she needed to say to him that was outside the official channel and that she had been carrying for 6 days. He was where Dawson always was in the evenings, in the small room adjacent to the operations center that served as his office, with a map on the table and a radio on the shelf, and the persistent low-level attention of a man who was never entirely off duty, who had made a certain kind of peace with the fact that the job did not have an off switch. She knocked on the doorframe. He looked up. "Sit down, Vaughn," he said. She sat. For a moment, neither of them said anything. Dawson had the particular quality of patience that she had come to recognize over 8 months as his version of generosity, giving the other person the space to start the conversation at the beginning they chose rather than the beginning he would have chosen, which was always efficient and sometimes premature. "I want to say something," she said. "Go ahead." "The day of the ambush. When I asked for one more minute on the radio, when I said please." She looked at him. "You gave it to me. You didn't have to. By every standard of tactical protocol and command authority, you had the right to pull the element and close the engagement. You gave me 60 seconds on the basis of, I don't know exactly what the basis was. I want to know." Dawson looked at her for a moment. He had the expression of a man who is being asked to explain a decision that he made below the level of articulation and is now working to bring it up to language. "You said please," he said. "That's not a reason." "For most people, no. For you, 8 months of watching you operate, and I have never once heard you ask for anything you didn't have a specific operational justification for. You asked for 60 seconds, and you used the word please, which told me the operational justification was not the kind I could evaluate by the standard criteria." He paused. "It told me you were asking as a person, not as an operator." She looked at him. "And I decided," he said, "that a person who had just done what you did in that operation in those preceding hours had earned the right to one request I didn't fully understand." "That's a significant command judgment to make in real time," she said. "Yes," he agreed. "It is. And it was the right call, and I knew it was the right call when I made it, and I cannot give you a cleaner tactical reason than that because there isn't one." He paused. "Your father trained soldiers for 20 years. Did he ever do anything like that? Make a call he couldn't fully justify?" She thought about it. "He made a decision in 2016 to spend 14 months teaching a young Afghan soldier everything he knew about long-range precision fire," she said. "The justification at the time was program objectives. The real reason was that he recognized something in the student and he couldn't not teach it." Dawson was quiet. "That decision," she said, "produced Tariq Mansour, which produced 19 months of casualties, which produced last Tuesday, which is why I'm sitting here." She looked at him. He couldn't have known where it would go. He could only be true to what he saw in front of him. "And you think that was right even with what it cost?" She thought about Mansour's voice on the radio. She thought about him standing up in the open at 690 meters with his hands away from his body. She thought about her father's notebook and Mansour's name in it, and the note her father had written beside it in the careful small handwriting she had known since childhood. Exceptional patience, natural geometry rare. "I think the alternative was worse," she said. "An extraordinary capability left untaught in the hands of a grief that had nothing to hold on to. What my father gave him was the only structure that survived everything else that was taken." She paused. "What I gave him on that radio was proof that the structure still existed, that the teacher was real even after the teacher was gone." She paused once more. "That was worth 60 seconds. 043200. Dawson nodded. He looked at the map on his table. He looked at it for a moment with the particular attention of a man who is seeing more than geography. "The team is going to miss you," he said in the original configuration. "I'm not going anywhere," she said. "The orders reassign my designation, not my team." He looked up. "I read the orders carefully," she said. "Lead sniper designation, SEAL Team 6 East Theater. There is no transfer. I stay with this element." She paused. "Unless you want me somewhere else." Dawson's expression went through several changes in a very short time. She had not seen him surprised before. It was an interesting thing to observe. "That was your request," he said, when they offered the reassignment. "I asked Solace if I could retain the medical designation and stay with this team. He said it would require some calls and some forms. Apparently the calls were made and the forms were updated." Dawson was quiet for a long moment. "You could go anywhere," he said. "With what you demonstrated last week, you could name the assignment." "I know," she said. "I want this one." "Why?" She looked at him, because Torres held his own wound packing for an hour without complaining, so I could get to the roof, because Reyes moved his position when I told him to without knowing why, because Chun put my name first on the Barrett case, because Brock, who has never apologized for anything in his professional life, sat with what he owed me for 6 days and then paid it without hedging. She paused. Because you gave me 60 seconds and used the word please like it was a complete justification. She held his gaze. These are my people, Lieutenant. You don't leave your people because the paperwork offers you an upgrade. Dawson looked at her for a long time. Something in his face settled the way a structure settles when the final component is placed and the whole thing finds its equilibrium. All right, he said. Then welcome home, Vaughn. Oshar 44000. She slept that night. Properly fully, the kind of sleep that comes when the body understands that it has completed something and can afford to rest without keeping one layer of attention standing guard. She dreamed about Montana, about a cold morning and a long range and the sound of wind and dry grass, about her father standing behind her with his hands in his jacket pockets and his eyes on the target, not watching her because he was past the point of needing to watch her and had arrived at the point of simply being present while she did the work they had built together. In the dream, she took the shot, and it was perfect. Not the absence of imperfection, but the real thing. The thing that exists when everything you know is applied to everything the moment requires, and the result is not luck, but inevitability. And her father said nothing, which was what he said when she had done something that did not require comment. She woke at 0500 with the specific quality of clarity that good sleep and a resolved grief can produce together. And she lay still for a moment and let the day assemble itself around her. Then she got up, picked up her medical kit, checked the inventory the way she always did, closed it, and walked out into the early morning, where Camp Resolute was doing what it always did, running on diesel and determination and the particular stubborn human conviction that the work in front of you is worth doing even when the cost of it is high. Chun was at the equipment table. He looked up when she came out. 0700 briefing, and he said, Dawson has something. I'll be there, she said. She set her kit down beside the Barrett case. She looked at the label Chun had put on it. Her name first, his name second, both of them in the same block letters, the same size, the same permanence. She thought about her father's voice on a cold hillside telling her that the rifle was only as clean as the reason you carried it. She thought about everything the last 6 days had cost and everything they had produced, and the distance between those two things that was not a contradiction, but a reckoning, the honest accounting of what purpose requires and what it returns. She picked up the rifle. She was exactly where she was supposed to be, carrying exactly what she had been built to carry, and she was not her father's student anymore. She was her father's answer.